The year was 1885, when the Arizona Territory stretched endless and merciless beneath the relentless sun. In these parched lands, where summer brought both mesmerizing beauty and brutal desolation, survival depended on water more precious than gold, and compassion was as rare as rain in drought season. This is the extraordinary tale of Margaret Hollister, a crippled widow with an unbreakable spirit, and Kaya Tewanima, a Hopi scout whose wisdom transcended the harsh prejudices that divided their worlds. Abandoned, desperate, and facing certain death in the most punishing heatwave in decades, Margaret's journey would become a testament to human resilience and the profound connections that can form when all hope seems lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1885 descended upon the Arizona Territory with unprecedented vengeance. From mesa to canyon, the landscape transformed into a furnace of shimmering heat, its stark beauty masking deadly intent. Those who had survived previous summers knew to preserve water, seek shade, and respect the desert's unforgiving nature. The sun blazed mercilessly from cloudless skies, baking the earth until it cracked like ancient pottery, while hot winds carried dust through settlements with the persistence of hungry coyotes. In the mining town of Copper Springs, residents retreated to their homes during midday hours, dampening cloths to cool their necks and telling stories to distract from the oppressive heat. All except for one household that sat at the edge of town, a modest adobe dwelling with a small garden withering in the sun, showing fewer signs of life each day. Margaret Hollister sat in her wheelchair by the window, her fingers tracing the outline of a letter she'd read so many times the paper had grown thin at the folds. At 36, her face retained its delicate beauty, though grief had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Her chestnut hair, usually pinned neatly, hung loose around her shoulders, and her hazel eyes, once bright with determination, now carried the vacant look of someone who had lost their purpose in the world. 4 months, she whispered to herself, counting the days since her husband Robert had been laid to rest. The mining accident that had claimed his life had been swift and merciless, leaving Margaret alone in a community that had initially welcomed them for Robert's engineering expertise, but now viewed her as a burden, a crippled woman whose legs had been crushed in the same stagecoach accident that had brought them west 3 years earlier. The small water barrel by her door had dwindled, alarmingly. In the kitchen, her pantry held only a few cups of cornmeal, half a sack of beans, and some dried apricots. Not enough to last the season. Not nearly enough. A sharp knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. "Mrs. Hollister, it's Mayor." "Caldwell, I need a word." Margaret wheeled herself carefully across the uneven floor and opened the door, allowing a blast of hot air to enter along with the imposing figure of Silas Caldwell. "Mayor," she acknowledged with a polite nod. "Please, come in." Caldwell removed his hat, but remained standing near the door, making it clear this would not be a lengthy visit. His eyes, small and calculating, surveyed her dwindling supplies and the engineering books that remained after Margaret had sold what she could to buy food. "Mrs. Hollister, I'll be direct. The town council met last night regarding your situation." Margaret steeled herself. Since Robert's death, the town council had become increasingly involved in her affairs, offering opinions she hadn't requested and solutions that benefited everyone but her. "And what did the council determine about my private matters this time?" she asked, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. Caldwell's expression hardened. "Now, Margaret, there's no need for that tone. We are concerned citizens looking out for one of our own. The fact is, you can't sustain yourself here. Your husband's position at the mine was always meant to be temporary until the initial expansion was complete. The new engineer arrives from Denver next month." "By temporary, Margaret knew he meant they had never expected to deal with a widow, especially one confined to a wheelchair. The town had made it clear that while a married woman with a disability might be tolerated, a crippled widow was somehow an affront to the frontier spirit they prided themselves on. "The Donovan wagon train is heading east to Santa Fe tomorrow," Caldwell continued. "They've agreed to take you along. Mr. Donovan has connections with a charity house there. Perhaps you could find placement in a proper institution." "An institution," Margaret repeated, incredulity rising in her voice. "Mayor Caldwell, I came to this town to help establish your water management system. I've kept Robert's engineering notes and correspondence. I've shown your miners how to shore up tunnels with less timber. I've taught your children mathematics. When your schoolmaster was laid up with fever, and now you suggest I be locked away like a broken piece of furniture." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. "The situation has changed, Mrs. Hollister. Without your husband's income and with your condition—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at her wheelchair. "This is a generous offer. The Donovans are good people." Margaret knew the Donovans. Judith Donovan had made it abundantly clear she found Margaret's presence disturbing, a constant reminder of misfortune that might somehow contaminate her own healthy family. She had been the first to stop visiting after Robert's death, claiming the sight of Margaret's wheelchair gave her nervous spells. "And if I decline?" Margaret asked quietly. Caldwell's face reddened. "Then I'm afraid the town can't be responsible. For what happens? Your supplies won't last the month, let alone until the autumn rains. We've all got families to care for, Mrs. Hollister. Charity has its limits." There it was, the threat wrapped in concern. Take the offer or starve. Margaret felt a heat that had nothing to do with the summer seeping into her bones. "I need time to think," she said. "The Donovans leave at first light," Caldwell replied, already turning toward the door. "Pack only essentials. Their wagon will be full, and they're doing you a great courtesy." After he left, Margaret wheeled herself to the small desk where Robert's engineering journals still lay open. The memory of his hands, strong and sure, as they sketched irrigation systems and mine supports, brought fresh grief welling up inside her. They had come west together, filled with hope and purpose. Robert would design safer mines. Margaret would apply her knowledge of desert botany to develop drought-resistant gardens, and together they would help build a community founded on more than mere mineral extraction. Now half of that dream lay buried in the hard desert earth, and the other half was being stripped away by those who had once welcomed her husband's expertise, but now saw only her wheelchair and widowhood. Margaret spent the night in restless contemplation. The practical part of her mind urged acceptance of the Donovans' offer. Santa Fe was larger with more opportunities, perhaps, but her heart rebelled. The Donovans were traveling east to join a larger freight operation. Their interests were purely financial, and their opinions on a disabled woman's proper place were firmly fixed. Life under their escort would mean the death of her dignity. By morning, she had made her decision. She would not go. When the Donovan wagon rolled past her home without stopping, Margaret felt a momentary panic. Had Mayor Caldwell even told them of her refusal? Had they simply assumed she wouldn't join them? She watched through her window as the wagon disappeared into the shimmering heat, feeling both relief and dread at the future that awaited her. 3 days later, Margaret's situation had grown desperate. The temperature had climbed even higher, and her water barrel was nearly empty. She had taken to moving as little as possible, conserving energy and moisture as the desert plants did. Her food supplies were critically low. On the 4th morning, she woke to find her small garden completely withered. The heat had killed even the hardy desert plants she had carefully cultivated. With trembling hands, she dressed and forced herself outside to check her rain barrel one last time. The world beyond her door had transformed into something alien and hostile. Heat rose in visible waves from the cracked earth, distorting the landscape into a dreamlike state. The path to town was clearly visible, but seemed to stretch impossibly far, though smoke from distant chimneys proved life continued there without her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. As Margaret struggled to maneuver her wheelchair back inside, a figure appeared at the edge of her property. For a moment, hope flared that someone from town had come to check on her welfare. Then she recognized the tall, imposing silhouette of Victor Harmon, the banker who had extended credit to her after Robert's death, credit that had run out weeks ago. "Mrs. Hollister," Harmon called, approaching her with a handkerchief pressed to his face against the dust. "Didn't expect to find you still here. Thought you'd gone with the Donovans." Margaret gripped her wheelchair wheels tighter. "I declined their offer, Mr. Harmon." Harmon's weathered face registered surprise, then something closer to anger. "That wasn't wise, Mrs. Hollister. Not wise at all." He glanced at her withering garden and the nearly empty water barrel. "I came to check if there might be anything of value left in the house. Mayor Caldwell mentioned you'd likely abandoned it, and there's the matter of your outstanding debt at my bank." The boldness of his assumption that she would simply disappear, that her home and belongings would be forfeit, struck Margaret like a physical blow. "This is my property, Mr. Harmon. I've not abandoned anything." Harmon's expression hardened. "Property requires payment of taxes, Mrs. Hollister. Taxes I doubt you can afford. As for your debt—" "I will settle my debt," Margaret interrupted, summoning dignity despite her desperate circumstances. "But not by surrendering my home to scavengers." A dangerous look crossed Harmon's face. "Careful with your words, Mrs. Hollister. You've no protector now, and summer's just begun. Pride makes for cold comfort when the water runs out." With that thinly veiled threat, he turned and walked back toward town, leaving Margaret shaking, partly from exhaustion, partly from fury, and partly from the terrible knowledge that he was right. She had food for perhaps another week, water for 3 days if she was careful, and no prospects for obtaining more of either. That night, as temperatures remained punishingly high and dust seeped through her window frames, Margaret faced the truth she had been avoiding. She would not survive this summer alone. The town had made its decision about her value, and that decision amounted to abandonment. In the darkest hours before dawn, Margaret made a final, desperate plan. She would attempt to reach the trading post at Yellow Canyon, some 12 miles. To the west, the Hopi and Navajo traded there, and Robert had made connections with them during his survey work. It was a perilous journey in good weather for an able-bodied person, potentially fatal in these conditions for a woman in a wheelchair, but remaining meant certain death. By first light, she had packed everything she could carry. A small amount of food, Robert's compass, matches wrapped carefully in cloth, her remaining water in canteens, and his old spyglass. She dressed in layers despite the heat, knowing the sun could burn exposed skin in hours, and covered her head with a wide-brimmed hat secured with a scarf. As Margaret wheeled herself out into the bitter morning, a sense of finality washed over her. She might never see this home again, the home where she and Robert had laughed and loved and planned their future. Tears threatened to evaporate on her cheeks as she whispered a goodbye to the life they had built and the dreams now buried with him. The journey began, promisingly enough. Though the ground was uneven and her arms ached with the effort of pushing her wheelchair through sandy soil, the early morning hours provided some relief from the worst heat. Margaret oriented herself using Robert's compass, keeping the distant mountains to her left as she pushed westward toward Yellow Canyon. For the first few hours, determination drove her forward. She pictured the trading post with its stone walls, its store of supplies, its familiar faces of the tribal traders who had always treated Robert with respect. Perhaps there she could find someone willing to escort her to the larger settlement at Fort Defiance, where her knowledge of botany and engineering might still have value. But as midday approached, the heat intensified to unbearable levels. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Margaret's progress slowed to a crawl. Her arms, never as strong as she might have wished since the accident, began to fail her. The wheelchair caught repeatedly on rocks and desert scrub, each time requiring exhausting effort to free it. "Keep moving," she urged herself, Robert's voice seeming to echo in her mind. To stop is to die. But as the punishing day wore on, Margaret realized with growing horror that she was lost. The landmarks she had tried to memorize from Robert's maps were confusing in the shimmering heat, appearing closer or farther than they truly were. Worse, her strength was failing rapidly. Each push of her wheelchair required more effort than the last, and a dangerous dizziness began to overtake her, the first warning sign of heat stroke that Robert had once described. As the sun began its slow descent, Margaret's wheelchair caught on a large rock, tipping precariously to one side. With her remaining strength, she managed to avoid completely overturning. But the chair remained stuck, immovable, despite her increasingly feeble attempts to free it. With no choice left, she dragged herself from the chair to the meager shade of a stunted mesquite tree nearby. Its sparse branches offered minimal protection from the sun, but it was better than nothing. With the last of her strength, she pulled her remaining water canteen close and wrapped herself in the lightest cloth she had brought to keep the direct sun from her skin. "Just until the heat passes," Margaret murmured, knowing even as the words left her lips that she was lying to herself. The heat showed no signs of abating, and even if it did, she had no way to move with her wheelchair now hopelessly tangled in the desert scrub. The canteen, when she uncapped it with trembling hands, contained less water than she had hoped. The day's journey had required more frequent sips than planned, and now barely an inch remained at the bottom. Margaret rationed a tiny sip, just enough to moisten her cracked lips, before securing the cap tightly again. Time became fluid under the desert sun, stretching and contracting like a mirage on the horizon. Margaret tried to maintain awareness, knowing that allowing her mind to wander was as dangerous as letting her body rest too long in one position. She recited botanical classifications of desert plants she could identify from her meager shelter, then moved to engineering equations Robert had taught her, anything to keep her thoughts ordered. As afternoon crawled toward evening, the cruel paradox of the desert revealed itself. The heat that had been her enemy all day would soon be replaced by cold that could be equally deadly. Desert nights dropped to frigid temperatures, particularly in the higher elevations, and Margaret had only her light traveling clothes for protection. Her thoughts drifted to Copper Springs, to the people who had so easily discarded her. Would anyone notice her absence? Would they send search parties, or would they simply claim her property as payment for imagined debts? Mayor Caldwell would likely spin a tale of her stubbornness, shaking his head in false regret while dividing her possessions among the vultures who had circled her home in recent weeks. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in brilliant oranges and reds. In other circumstances, Margaret might have marveled at the beauty, but now she saw only the approaching danger of night. She arranged what meager supplies she had brought to create a small windbreak and huddled against the trunk of the mesquite, conserving what little warmth her body still generated. As darkness fell, the transformation was swift and merciless. The heat that had tormented her all day fled into the vast sky, leaving bitter cold in its wake. Margaret pulled her lightweight shawl tighter, knowing it was woefully inadequate for desert nights. She had known this intellectually when planning her escape, but the reality of the cold was still shocking. "Robert," she whispered into the darkness, his name catching in her throat. "I tried." The stars emerged, brilliant and countless in the clear desert air. Margaret found the patterns she and Robert had often traced from their porch on warm evenings: Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, the bright point of Polaris. The familiar configurations offered cold comfort as she felt her body's warmth leaching into the ground beneath her. Sometime in the deepening night, Margaret heard the distant howl of coyotes. Under normal circumstances, she might have feared them, but now they seemed like harbingers of an end that was already approaching. Her body shivered uncontrollably, her muscles clenching and unclenching in a desperate attempt to generate heat. "Keep awake," she commanded herself, pinching her arms and legs when her eyelids grew heavy. To sleep in such cold without proper shelter would be to invite death. Yet exhaustion pulled at her with inexorable force, draining her resistance with each passing hour. As the night reached its coldest point, Margaret's thoughts grew increasingly disordered. She imagined Robert sitting beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his voice encouraging her to hold on until morning. She conversed with her long-dead parents, explaining her wheelchair and her journey west. These hallucinations came and went, interspersed with moments of lucidity where the stark reality of her situation reasserted itself. The eastern sky lightened imperceptibly, the first hint that night would eventually surrender to day. Margaret had survived the darkness, but at tremendous cost. Her body felt distant, responding sluggishly to her commands. Her mouth was so dry that her tongue seemed to stick to her palate, and the dizziness that had begun the previous day now made the world tilt alarmingly whenever she moved her head. With the rising sun came renewed heat, building quickly from mild to oppressive. Margaret uncapped her canteen and allowed herself another small sip, stretching out the precious liquid. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most exquisite sensation she had experienced in hours. Her wheelchair remained where she had abandoned it, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far for her weakened body. Without it, she was not only stranded but fundamentally altered. Her mobility, hard-won through years of adjustment to her disability, completely stripped away. Margaret had never felt so utterly vulnerable, not even in the immediate aftermath of the accident that had taken her legs. As the morning progressed, Margaret took stock of her dire situation with brutal honesty. Her remaining water would last perhaps until midday if carefully rationed. Her food, though technically sufficient for another day, would be worthless without water to help digest it. Her shelter was woefully inadequate against the sun that climbed higher with each passing minute. She had survived the night only to face a day that promised to be even more merciless than the one before. The irony was not lost on her. To have escaped the slow death of abandonment in Copper Springs, only to face a quicker end in the open desert. By mid-morning, the heat had become a living thing, pressing down upon her with physical weight. Margaret's skin felt papery and tight, her lips cracked and bleeding despite her careful rationing of water. The dizziness had worsened, and now nausea joined it, her body rebelling against the extreme conditions. She had heard stories of desert, mirages, visions of water and shade that tormented the dying. Now she experienced them firsthand, seeing impossible pools of water shimmer and vanish at the edges of her vision. More troubling were the sounds, voices calling her name, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant toll of Copper Springs Church. A bell. Her rational mind knew these were hallucinations, but that knowledge provided little comfort as reality and imagination blurred together. In a moment of clarity, Margaret realized she needed to leave some record of her passing. Using the last of her strength, she pulled Robert's engineering journal from her small pack and opened it to a blank page at the back. With the pencil he had always kept tucked in the binding, she wrote in shaky letters, "Margaret Hollister, June 1885. I lived as I could, not as others wished. Tell the Hartmans in Boston I loved their daughter to the end." It was a meager epitaph, but it was all she could manage. The pencil fell from her nerveless fingers as another wave of dizziness washed over her. The journal remained open on her lap, the words already beginning to blur as sweat dripped from her forehead onto the page. The sun reached its zenith, directly overhead and unforgiving. Margaret retreated into memories, her childhood in Boston, her education that had scandalized her mother's friends, her first meeting with Robert at a lecture on hydraulic engineering. These recollections came with increasing difficulty, her thoughts fragmenting under the assault of heat and dehydration. In the distance, heat waves distorted the landscape, making the mountains appear to dance. Within one of these wavering distortions, a figure seemed to materialize, tall and moving with purposeful strides across terrain that had defeated Margaret's wheelchair. She blinked slowly, certain this was another mirage. The figure remained, growing more distinct as it approached. "Another trick," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "The desert is cruel to the end." Yet the figure continued its approach, resolute and real. As it drew closer, Margaret could make out details. A man dressed in clothing that blended traditional Hopi elements with practical frontier wear. He moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the harsh landscape, his steps precise and economical. When he was perhaps 50 yards away, he paused, scanning the area with careful attention. His gaze settled on Margaret, huddled in the inadequate shade of the mesquite. For a long moment, he observed her from a distance, his expression unreadable. Margaret made no attempt to call out or signal. Her strength was gone, and besides, she was not convinced this wasn't another hallucination, more vivid than the others perhaps, but no more real than the phantom water pools that had tormented her all morning. The man approached with caution, his movements deliberate. When he reached the edge of the meager shade where Margaret rested, he crouched to bring himself to her eye level, maintaining a respectful distance. "You are far from shelter, white woman," he said in perfect, lightly accented English. "The sun claims many lives in these lands." Margaret stared at him, struggling to determine if she was truly hearing spoken words or merely imagining them. "Are you real?" she asked, her cracked lips barely able to form the question. Something like surprise flickered across the man's weathered face. "As real as the earth beneath us," he replied, studying her with increased concern. He reached for a water skin at his side, uncapping it and offering it to her. "Drink, but slowly. Too much at once will make you sick." The water skin felt solid in Margaret's trembling hands. Not a mirage, then. She followed his instruction, taking a small sip that felt like heaven on her parched throat. The water was cool, tasting faintly of minerals from underground springs. "I am Kaya," the man said as she drank. "Kaya Tewanima. I scout for trading parties between Yellow Canyon and the settlements." "Margaret," she managed after another careful sip. "Margaret Hollister. I was trying to reach the trading post." Kaya's eyes moved to the wheelchair trapped in the scrub some distance away, then back to Margaret's useless legs stretched before her. Understanding dawned in his expression. "You came alone, without horse or companion, across open desert?" There was no judgment in his tone, merely assessment of the situation. Margaret nodded weakly. "Copper Springs left me no choice. It was try or die slowly." Gaia considered this, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then he looked at the position of the sun, calculating time and distance. "You cannot stay here," he stated matter-of-factly. "The afternoon will be worse than the morning. Can you ride if assisted?" The question momentarily confused Margaret until she noticed the horse grazing a short distance away, a sturdy pinto that blended so well with the landscape she hadn't observed it before. I think so," she said, though in truth she wasn't certain. Her body felt disconnected, responding sluggishly to her commands. "My legs don't work, but my arms can hold on if necessary." Kaya nodded once, decision made. I will take you to my shelter. It lies 3 miles west, near the canyon walls where there is water and shade. We must move quickly before the worst. Heat comes. Without waiting for further discussion, he gathered Margaret's meager supplies, securing them efficiently. Then he approached her wheelchair, examining how it had become entangled in the desert scrub. This was well made, he observed, working to free it with practiced hands. I cannot bring it now, but will return for it later if possible. The realization that she would be separated from her wheelchair, her independence, her mobility, sent a fresh wave of panic through Margaret. Yet she understood the practical necessity. The chair was heavy and unwieldy. There was no way to transport both it and her on a single horse across difficult terrain. There's a leather bag attached to the side, she said, pointing weakly. My husband's tools. Please, if you can. Kaya retrieved the tool roll without comment, adding it to the items he had already secured. Then he returned to Margaret, crouching beside her again. I must carry you to the horse, he explained. It will be uncomfortable but necessary. Margaret nodded her consent, past the point of pride or propriety. As Kaya lifted her with surprising gentleness, she realized how light she had become in recent months. Grief and rationing had whittled her frame to essential components, bone and tendon and stubborn will. He settled her carefully on his horse, arranging her useless legs as comfortably as possible before mounting behind her. One strong arm encircled her waist, steadying her against the movement of the horse. Hold fast to the mane, he instructed. We will go slowly, but the terrain is uneven. As they began moving away from the mesquite that had been her reluctant shelter, Margaret looked back at her abandoned wheelchair. It represented both her limitation and her independence, the visible symbol of how the world saw her and the tool that had allowed her to defy their expectations. Will I ever see it again? She wondered aloud, her voice barely audible. Kaya's response came after a thoughtful pause. His words carried just above the sound of the horse's hooves on the packed earth. The desert takes what is abandoned, but sometimes returns what is truly valued. We will see. As they rode westward toward the distant canyon walls, Margaret's consciousness flickered like a candle in desert wind, present then absent, aware, then drifting. The rhythmic motion of the horse beneath her and the solid presence of Kaya behind her were her only anchors to reality as the merciless sun continued its arc across the sky. Her last coherent thought, before surrendering to exhaustion, was that fate had indeed found her, but it had come in a form very different from what she had imagined. Not the slow abandonment of Copper Springs or the quick death of the desert's embrace, but in the unexpected meeting of two souls from vastly different worlds, connected by nothing more than human recognition of another's desperate need. Margaret drifted through layers of consciousness, caught between the scorching embrace of desert heat and fleeting sensations of coolness. Her dreams were fragmented. Robert calling her name, the contemptuous face of Mayor Caldwell, her wheelchair spinning uselessly in sand, and through it all, the distant sound of rhythmic chanting that seemed to have no source. When awareness finally returned, it came gradually. First the gentle sound of water trickling, then the scent of unfamiliar herbs and cooking, and finally the realization that she lay on a soft pallet rather than the hard desert floor. She opened her eyes to find herself in a shelter unlike any she had seen before. It was a small structure with stone walls on 3 sides, built directly against the red sandstone of a canyon wall. The 4th side was a carefully constructed screen of woven branches and fabric that filtered the harsh sunlight while allowing air to circulate. The entire space radiated a surprising coolness, a stark contrast to the blistering heat she remembered. You return to the living. The voice startled her. Kaya sat cross-legged near a small cooking fire in the center of the shelter, his hands busy preparing something in a stone mortar. In the diffused light, she could see his features more clearly, strong cheekbones, deep set, eyes that reflected wisdom beyond his years, hair worn longer than white men's, but tied back practically. He wore simple clothing adorned with geometric patterns, functional rather than decorative. "How long?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. 3 days, he replied, setting aside his work. "The fever of the heat took you. I thought perhaps your spirit had decided to journey onward." 3 days. She had lost 3 days to the desert's fury. Margaret attempted to sit up, only to find her limbs disconcertingly weak, as if she'd suffered a long illness rather than simply slept. "Slowly," Kaya cautioned, rising to bring her a clay cup filled with clear water. "Your body remembers the heat. It will take time to forget." The cup cooled her hands pleasantly as she inhaled the clean scent of fresh water, a luxury she had nearly forgotten in her desperate state. When she sipped cautiously, the flavor surprised her, sweeter and more refreshing than any water she had tasted in Copper Springs. "This is good," she murmured, taking another sip. "Thank you for this, and for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the shelter, the water, her continued existence. Kaya nodded once in acknowledgement, returning to his place by the fire. "The desert shows no mercy to those unprepared." "Why did you travel alone in such conditions?" The question was direct, without judgment, simply seeking information. Margaret found herself explaining her situation: Robert's death in the mine, the town's withdrawal of support, her desperate attempt to reach Yellow Canyon. Kaya listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Your people abandoned one of their own," he said when she finished, the statement flat, but carrying an undercurrent of something not quite anger, but perhaps disapproval. "They saw no value in keeping me," Margaret replied, unable to keep bitterness from her voice. "A crippled widow has little purpose in their eyes." Kaya seemed to consider this. "The Hopi value all who contribute wisdom or skill. A woman who knows plants and water systems would not be cast out, even if her legs do not carry her." His words, though simply stated, carried a weight that made Margaret's throat tighten with emotion. The validation of her worth, something Copper Springs had systematically stripped away, came unexpectedly from a man whose people were portrayed as primitives in the newspapers that occasionally reached their settlement. "The heat continues," Kaya said, changing the subject. 4 days now, the worst I have seen in many summers. Will your strength return soon?" "I think so," Margaret answered, suddenly conscious that she represented an additional burden on resources. "That had been meant for one. I don't want to impose on your hospitality longer than necessary." A hint of amusement crossed his face. "I prepare well for summer moons. My people do not waste or hoard. The canyon provides water even when the valley's dry." He gestured toward a narrow crevice in the back wall, where clear water seeped from the rock face, collecting in a small basin before draining away through a carefully constructed channel. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you are stronger, I will show you this place. It has been my summer shelter for 4 seasons." Margaret nodded, still overwhelmed by the strangeness of her situation. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have left me." "Many would have." Kaya looked up from tending the small fire, his dark eyes meeting hers directly across the space between them. "Would you have left someone to die in the sun if you had the means to help them?" "No," Margaret admitted, "but I'm not—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express the thought without giving offense. "Not Hopi," he finished for her, his expression unchanged. "And I am not white. Yet the sun does not ask what color skin burns beneath it. The rain does not care what language thanks it for falling. We are all simply human before the elements. The profound simplicity of his worldview silenced her. Margaret finished her water, feeling strength gradually returning to her body. As the day progressed, she drifted in and out of sleep, her system demanding rest to recover from its ordeal. Each time she woke, Kaya was engaged in some task, preparing food, crafting arrows, sorting plants he had gathered from the sparse vegetation near the canyon. By evening, Margaret felt well enough to sit up properly, propped against the cool stone wall of the shelter. The heat continued unabated outside, its intensity evident in the waves visible through the screened entrance. But inside the shelter, maintained its remarkable coolness. Kaya prepared a simple meal, a porridge of ground corn mixed with dried berries and nuts that tasted better than anything Margaret had eaten since Robert died. "Your shelter," she said as they ate. "It's remarkable. I've never seen anything like it. The old ones built here long ago," he explained, gesturing to the stonework. "I found it abandoned, rebuilt what had fallen. The canyon wall blocks the afternoon sun. The seep water cools the air. I add my own knowledge to theirs." "You built this alone?" she asked, impressed by the craftsmanship. Kaya nodded. "4 summers ago. Each year I return, strengthen what is weakened, improve what can be better. It becomes stronger with time." Something in his tone suggested he spoke of more than just the shelter. Margaret found herself curious about this man who lived between worlds, clearly maintaining Hopi traditions, while also interacting enough with white settlements to speak excellent English and understand their ways. "You mentioned trading parties," she said cautiously. "Do you work for the trading post?" "I guide when the terms are fair. I understand the land, the water sources, the movement of people. Information has value." His pragmatism surprised her. "Isn't that difficult, given the tensions between your people and the settlers?" Kaya's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a complexity of emotion she couldn't decipher. "The world changes. The old places grow fewer. The white settlements spread like wildfire after rain. My people follow the ancient ways, but we must also understand the new ones to survive." He added more water to the cooking pot. "I learned your language at the government school when I was young. Later I served as translator when the officials came with papers. Now I walk between both worlds, trusted completely by neither." The loneliness implied by that statement resonated with Margaret's own sense of displacement. She too existed in a space between expectations, too educated and independent to be accepted as a proper frontier wife, yet unable to claim the professional status a man with her qualifications would receive without question. "That must be difficult," she offered quietly. Kaya made a non-committal gesture. "It is the path I walk. Each path has stones that bruise the feet." Their conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as the fire burned low. Outside, the heat seemed to gain new strength, pressing against the shelter's defenses with fresh determination. Despite its fury, the structure held firm, maintaining its oasis of relative coolness. "Will sleep come easier tonight?" Kaya asked, noting Margaret's attention to the waves of heat visible through the entrance. "I think so," she replied, though, in truth, the memory of her near death still hovered at the edges of her consciousness. "Though the heat's voice is difficult to forget, then listen to another voice instead," he suggested. To her surprise, he began to speak in a rhythmic cadence, words flowing in his native Hopi. Though she couldn't understand their meaning, the sound was mesmerizing, rising and falling like wind, moving through canyon walls, strong yet soothing. "What is that?" she asked when he paused. "A summer story," he explained, "about how Spider Grandmother taught the people to find water in the dreest places. My grandfather told this when children feared the hot moons." "It's beautiful," Margaret said sincerely. Would you tell it in English? I'd like to understand." Something like approval flickered across Kaya's face. He settled more comfortably before the fire and began to translate the tale, his voice taking on the same rhythmic quality despite the change in language. Margaret listened, entranced, as he wove the story of Spider Grandmother's cleverness, the suffering of the people during a great drought, and the wisdom learned about reading the land's subtle signs. When he finished, the heat still pressed against the shelter, but Margaret found she could hear it differently now. Not as the voice of death narrowly escaped, but as merely the backdrop to this unexpected moment of connection across cultures. "Your people have many such stories?" she asked. Kaya nodded. "Stories teach everything. How to live, how to find water, how to respect the spirits, how to understand the world. They are how wisdom passes from grandparent to child." "Not so different from my work then," Margaret observed. "Teaching is about stories, the story of plants and how they survive drought, the story of water and how it shapes the land, the story of structures and how they stand against time." For the first time, she saw Kaya's smile, a brief softening of his usually stoic expression that transformed his entire face. "Perhaps different peoples understand each other best through their stories," he said. "Without them, we are merely flesh that walks and breathes." That night, Margaret slept deeply, despite the continuing heat, Kaya's story having replaced her fear with something approaching wonder. When she woke the next morning, she found the shelter quiet. Kaya was absent, though his bow and quiver still hung on their pegs. He hadn't gone far. With effort, she pulled herself into a sitting position, noting how her strength was returning, though her useless legs remained a reminder of her vulnerability. She examined the shelter more carefully in the morning light, appreciating details she had missed before. The precise stonework of the walls, the ingenious ventilation system that drew air across the seepwater, cooling it before circulating. Through the space, the careful organization of supplies that maximized the small area. The shelter's entrance screen moved aside, admitting a blast of hot air and Kaya carrying an armload of plants. Dust rimmed his eyelashes and clung to his clothing, but his movements were as efficient and purposeful as ever. "The heat continues," he announced, kneeling to sort his gathered plants. "But there are signs of change. The hawks fly differently. Perhaps rain will come in a week's time." Margaret's heart lifted at the possibility. Then traveling might become possible again? He confirmed her thought with a nod. "Until then, we must live with what we have." He glanced at her, something like curiosity in his usually impassive expression. "You know plants?" "Some," she admitted. "I studied botany in the East and learned desert varieties from books and observation when we came west." Kaya separated. "A small pile of green stems topped with tiny white flowers. And these? Do your books name these?" Margaret studied the plants carefully. "Desert chicory, I believe. The roots can be ground for coffee substitute, and the greens are edible, though bitter." A ghost of a smile touched Kaya's lips. "Yes, though we call it sun follower for how the flowers track the day's light." He selected another plant. "And this one?" She recognized the spiky leaves immediately. "Yucca. The roots contain saponins, natural soap. The fibers make excellent cordage. The fruits are edible when properly prepared." This exchange continued, evolving into an impromptu knowledge-sharing session. Margaret identified plants from her academic learning, while Kaya supplied traditional uses unknown to Western science. Where their knowledge overlapped, they compared perspectives, sometimes agreeing, sometimes offering different interpretations of the same natural phenomenon. "Your teachers taught you well," Kaya observed as they finished sorting the gathered plants. "As did yours," Margaret replied, feeling a strange kinship with this man whose education had followed such different paths from her own, yet arrived at similar understandings of the natural world. "Perhaps we can both be teachers now," he suggested, reaching for a worn leather bag near his sleeping mat. From it, he withdrew something that made Margaret's breath catch. the leather tool roll she had asked him to salvage from her wheelchair. "You kept it," she whispered, emotions suddenly thick in her throat. "You said it was important," Kaya replied simply, handing it to her. "I did not know why until I looked inside." Margaret unrolled the leather carefully. Inside were Robert's precision. Tools, calipers, small measuring devices, drawing implements, but also several folded papers. She opened one to reveal detailed engineering drawings of water collection systems specifically designed for desert conditions. "Robert was working on these before he died," she explained, smoothing the creased paper. "Systems to capture and store rainfall more efficiently. He believed even small settlements could survive drought years with proper preparation." Kaya studied the drawings with evident interest. These would help many people, Hopi and white alike. "They're unfinished," Margaret admitted. "After the accident, I helped with calculations, but some practical problems remain unsolved." "Perhaps," Kaya said thoughtfully, "this is why your path crossed mine. I know how water moves in canyons, how it hides beneath seemingly dry washes, how the old ones built to preserve every drop. You know measurements and materials that do not break under pressure. The implication hung between them, the possibility that their chance encounter held purpose beyond mere survival, that their different knowledge might combine to create something neither could accomplish alone. As the day progressed into evening, they spread Robert's drawings on the smooth stone floor, weighing the corners with small rocks. Kaya described traditional Hopi water management techniques, while Margaret explained the engineering principles behind Robert's designs. They worked side by side, Margaret sketching modifications based on Kaya's suggestions, Kaya demonstrating concepts using small models shaped from clay. When they finally paused as darkness fell outside, Margaret realized something extraordinary had occurred. For hours, she had been fully engaged in meaningful work, her disability irrelevant to the task at hand. Kaya had neither patronized her knowledge nor exaggerated his own, treating their collaboration as a natural exchange between equals. "We work well together," she observed, setting aside her pencil. Kaya nodded, his expression thoughtful as he added wood to the small fire. "Two minds from different paths see what one alone cannot." As they shared a simple evening meal, a companionable silence settled between them. The unrelenting heat outside seemed less oppressive now that Margaret had regained her purpose, not just surviving, but potentially creating something of lasting value. When Kaya spoke again, his question took her by surprise. "What will you do when the rains come and travel becomes possible?" It was a practical question, yet Margaret heard deeper currents beneath it. What future awaited her when she could leave this temporary shelter? The question lingered, unspoken, but increasingly present. "I don't know," she admitted. "Yellow Canyon was my only plan, and that was born of desperation rather than careful thought." Kaya considered her words. "Sometimes desperation creates clearer vision than comfort. You saw no future in Copper Springs, so you left despite the danger, and nearly died for that choice," Margaret reminded him. "Yet here you sit," he countered, "working on plans that may help many. Perhaps the risk held purpose beyond your knowing." His perspective, finding meaning in what she had considered merely desperate flight, invited Margaret to reconsider her journey. Not as foolhardy abandonment of safety, but as necessary movement toward unknown possibility. "And you?" she asked. "What happens to your path when the rains come?" Kaya's expression revealed little, but his voice carried a note she hadn't heard before, something almost like hesitation. "I return to my people for the harvest ceremonies, then guide trading parties until winter comes. Each year the same cycle." "You don't sound entirely satisfied with that cycle," Margaret observed carefully. He met her gaze directly, something vulnerable briefly visible in his usually guarded expression. The path between worlds grows more difficult each season. My people see me as too influenced by white ways. The whites see only my skin, not my knowledge. The admission, clearly not offered lightly, resonated deeply with Margaret's own experience of existing between defined social categories, neither fully accepted as an educated woman nor permitted to channel her knowledge through traditional female roles after her disability and widowhood. Perhaps, she suggested quietly, those who walk between worlds need to create their own path rather than following those already established. Kaya added another small branch to the fire, watching the flames rise before responding. Such paths are not easily made or maintained. Those who attempt them often walk alone. Or perhaps, Margaret countered, they finally find others who share their vision, rather than their circumstances. The implication hung in the air between them, neither fully articulated nor easily dismissed. As darkness deepened outside their shelter, Margaret realized something had shifted in their relationship. What had begun as rescuer and rescued had evolved into something more complex, a partnership of minds that recognized complementary knowledge rather than focusing on obvious differences. The heat of the desert night pressed against the shelter walls, but inside a different warmth had begun to grow. The tentative connection of two individuals who had each been rejected by their respective communities, yet found unexpected resonance in shared purpose. Whether this connection could survive beyond the temporary sanctuary of the canyon shelter remained to be seen, but its very existence challenged assumptions. Both had carried about the unbridgeable distance between their worlds. Days blended into a rhythm as Margaret and Kaya continued their work on the water collection systems. The initial collaboration had sparked something neither had anticipated, a genuine synergy of knowledge that transcended their different backgrounds. Margaret's theoretical understanding of hydraulics combined with Kaya's practical experience of desert water patterns created solutions neither could have developed alone. This channel design, Margaret said one morning, tracing a line on the increasingly detailed plans, could we modify it to handle flash flooding? Robert always worried about sudden volume overwhelming the collection basins. Kaya considered the problem, his hands working a small-scale model in clay. The old ruins in the high canyons use step channels like this. He demonstrated by carving notches into the clay model. Water slows as it drops, deposits silt here rather than in the main basin. Margaret watched, fascinated. That's brilliant. It creates natural filtration while reducing erosion pressure. Robert tried complex mechanical filters that constantly clogged. Simple solutions last longest, Kaya observed, a philosophy that seemed to guide much of his approach to life. As they worked, Margaret learned that Kaya's understanding went beyond traditional knowledge passed through generations. He had also studied at a government school where Western science was taught alongside attempts to erase native culture, a bitter education he had nonetheless extracted value from. They believed knowledge only moves in one direction, he explained, while mixing a particularly effective mortar from local materials to repair a crack in the shelter wall. From white to native, they never asked what we already knew. That arrogance costs them valuable insights, Margaret replied, thinking of the elaborate and often failing water systems in settlements like Copper Springs, built with expensive, imported materials while ignoring centuries of indigenous adaptation to the same environment. The intensity of the heat wave finally began to diminish by small degrees. Though daytime temperatures remained punishing, the nights grew slightly more bearable. Kaya reported signs of distant thunderstorms on the horizon during his early morning scouting, promising relief that might be a week or more away. On the 10th day of Margaret's stay in the canyon shelter, Kaya returned from his morning reconnaissance. with news that changed their comfortable routine. "Riders," he announced as he entered, his expression more guarded than usual. "White men, 3 of them, following the old trading path that passes 2 miles north of here." Margaret felt a jolt of apprehension. "Military? Settlers?" "Prospectors, I think. They carry equipment for finding minerals, not for establishing camps." He began gathering his scouting gear with practiced efficiency. "I will observe them more closely, determine their purpose and direction." "Is there danger?" Margaret asked, sensing his concern beneath his calm exterior. Kaya paused, considering his words carefully. "Most who seek gold or silver in these lands care little for boundaries or laws. Some are merely desperate men seeking fortune. Others..." He left the thought unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Some prospectors represented a threat to anyone they encountered, particularly a solitary Hopi and a vulnerable white woman. "I should come with you," Margaret said impulsively. Kaya looked at her, then at her useless legs, his expression not unkind but realistic. "The path is difficult, even for those with full strength. You are safer here, hidden." The reminder of her physical limitations stung, though Margaret knew he spoke practical truth rather than judgment. Still, helplessness was not a feeling she accepted easily. "Then take this," she said, reaching for Robert's spyglass. "It's excellent quality, better than army issue. You can observe from greater distance." Kaya accepted the instrument with appreciation, testing its mechanism before securing it carefully in his pack. "I will return before sunset. Keep the fire small if you build one, less smoke to draw attention." After he departed, Margaret found the silence of the shelter oppressive in a way it hadn't been before. She had grown accustomed to their easy exchange of ideas, the quiet companionship that required no forced conversation. Now, alone with her thoughts, concerns multiplied. What if these prospectors found Kaya? Relations between natives and whites in the territory were strained at best, openly hostile at worst. Or what if they somehow discovered the shelter and her presence within it? How would they interpret finding a white woman living with a Hopi man, regardless of the circumstances? To occupy her restless mind, Margaret turned to Robert's engineering journal, reviewing the water system designs they had been refining. The work was coming together remarkably well, practical, scalable, and built from materials readily available in the territory. It represented the best of both their knowledge traditions, neither dominating the other. As the day advanced toward afternoon, Margaret's worry grew. Kaya had never been gone this long during her stay. Had something happened? Was he injured, captured, or worse? The possibilities tormented her. "Stop this," she muttered to herself, frustrated by her spiraling fears. "He knows this land better than anyone. He's survived here for years without your concern." Using her arms, she dragged herself to the entrance of the shelter, peering through the woven screen into the shimmering heat beyond. The canyon appeared peaceful, the only movement coming from occasional desert birds seeking shade among the sparse vegetation. No sign of approaching riders or returning scout. The waiting became unbearable. Margaret decided to make herself useful by preparing a meal from their provisions, something that would be ready whenever Kaya returned. The simple task of grinding corn and mixing it with dried herbs he had collected gave her hands purpose, while her mind continued to race through scenarios. The sun was approaching the western canyon rim, painting the red stone walls with deepening shadows, when she finally heard movement outside. Margaret tensed, straining to distinguish whether the approaching footsteps belonged to Kaya or strangers. The screen moved aside, and Kaya entered, dusty and weary, but unharmed. Relief washed over Margaret so powerfully she felt momentarily lightheaded. "You're back," she said, stating the obvious in her rush of emotion. He nodded, dropping his pack and accepting the water she offered. After drinking deeply, he settled cross-legged near the small fire where the corn cakes were cooking. "The prospectors have moved northward," he reported. "They follow rumors of silver in the high country near Painted Mesa. They did not see me." "They're not coming this way then?" "Not those three," Kaya confirmed, "but their presence means others may follow. The territorial newspapers have printed stories of mineral findings. Such news travels fast among desperate men. The implication was clear. Their peaceful isolation could not be guaranteed indefinitely. Sooner or later, increased traffic through the region would threaten their seclusion. I found something else. While watching them, Kaya continued, reaching into his pack. To Margaret's astonishment, he withdrew a familiar object, the folding wooden handle of her wheelchair. "You went back for it?" she asked, incredulous that he would take such a risk. "I passed near where we left it." The frame was still there. Though animals had chewed the leather seat, he laid out the disassembled parts he had managed to salvage. Some pieces can be repaired, others must be remade. The wheels are sound. Margaret ran her hands over the familiar components, emotion welling in her throat. The wheelchair represented independence she had thought permanently lost in the desert. Its recovery, even in damaged condition, symbolized possibility rather than limitation. "Thank you," she managed, the simple words inadequate for the profound gift his effort represented. "I never expected—" Kaya made a dismissive gesture. "A person should have the means to move as they choose. When I saw it was still there, the choice was simple. They ate their meal in companionable silence as darkness settled outside. Later, as they examined the wheelchair parts by firelight, discussing how to repair and rebuild what was damaged, Margaret found herself studying Kaya's face in the flickering light. The concentration in his expression as he assessed each component, the respectful way he handled the device that gave her mobility, these revealed a quality of character rare in any culture. "Why did you really go back for it?" she asked suddenly. "The truth, it wasn't on your path while tracking the prospectors." Kaya's hands stilled on the wheelchair frame. After a long moment, he met her gaze directly. "In my first year at the government school, they took our moccasins, said we must wear their shoes to become civilized. Some boys' feet bled from the stiff leather. Others developed sores that festered." His voice remained even, but Margaret sensed the old pain beneath. To take how a person moves through the world is to take part of their spirit. The simple story, told without self-pity or dramatics, struck Margaret deeply. He had recognized in her wheelchair not merely a mechanical device, but an extension of her personhood, something the civilized citizens of Copper Springs had never understood when they expected her to accept institutionalization. "We'll rebuild it," she said with newfound determination, "better than before." Over the next several days, they worked together to restore the wheelchair. Kaya fashioned new components from desert ironwood and carefully tanned rabbit skins, while Margaret applied her knowledge of mechanics to improve the wheel bearings, using materials from Robert's tool roll. The collaboration was different from their work on the water systems, more immediate, more personal, blending their skills toward a tangible object that would restore Margaret's independence. On the fourth day of their restoration project, as they were testing the newly rebuilt wheelchair inside the shelter, Kaya suddenly went still, his head tilted in the listening posture Margaret had come to recognize during their time together. "What is it?" she asked, immediately alert. "Horses," he replied quietly. "Several approaching from the south trail." Margaret felt fear spike through her. The prospectors returning. Different pattern. These move with purpose, not searching. Kaya moved to the entrance, carefully peering through a narrow gap in the screening. 5 riders. 4 wear the clothing of your people's army. 1 is dressed as a civilian. "The army?" Margaret whispered, confusion mixing with alarm. "Why would they be here?" Kaya's expression darkened. "Sometimes they patrol for natives who have left reservations. Sometimes they escort officials or important settlers." He turned to face her, his usual calm now layered with tension. "Sometimes they search for missing persons." The implication struck Margaret with sudden clarity. "You think they're looking for me?" "A white woman disappears from a settlement," Kaya reasoned. "Questions are asked. Perhaps someone saw you leave or knows which direction you took." The possibility had never occurred to Margaret. She had assumed Copper Springs would be glad to wash their hands of her, declaring her dead and dividing her few possessions among themselves. But what if someone had reported her missing? What if the Donovans had mentioned her absence when they reached Santa Fe? "What do we do?" she asked, instinctively turning to Kaya's judgment of their precarious situation. He considered their options, with characteristic thoroughness. They follow the main trail, not the canyon routes. They may pass without discovering this place. He glanced at their nearly completed projects, the water system designs spread across makeshift tables, the rebuilt wheelchair. "But if they are searching specifically for you, they will be thorough." Margaret faced a moment of decision she hadn't anticipated. If these riders were indeed searching for her, revealing herself meant potential rescue and return to white society, perhaps not to Copper Springs, but to some equivalent place where her disability would define her value. Remaining hidden with Kaya meant choosing continued existence outside social boundaries, with all the uncertainties that entailed. "Could we leave?" she suggested. "Move deeper into the canyon until they pass?" Kaya shook his head. "Too risky. The trails are exposed. They would see us, and seeing you with me would create more danger than discovery here." He gestured to her newly rebuilt wheelchair. "And you cannot yet move quickly on difficult terrain." He was right, of course. Her wheelchair, while functional on the smooth floor of the shelter, would be nearly useless on the rough canyon paths, and being spotted fleeing with a Hopi man would likely provoke military response rather than measured consideration. "Then I should meet them," Margaret decided with sudden clarity. "Alone, as if I've been surviving by myself. You can remain hidden until they leave." The plan was simple but potentially effective. If she presented herself as a determined widow who had successfully established a temporary shelter after fleeing abandonment, the soldiers would likely escort her to the nearest settlement without extensive search of the area. Kaya listened to her reasoning with an unreadable expression. "This protects me," he acknowledged, "but places you back in the world that discarded you." "Not necessarily," Margaret countered. "I can tell them I'm traveling to Fort Defiance once the weather permits. I have Robert's papers and our water system, designs to prove my technical knowledge. The army post there might value engineering skills more than Copper Springs did." A complex emotion flickered across Kaya's features, something Margaret couldn't quite identify. "And our work together, the systems we designed for both peoples?" "I would credit you," she assured him. "Make sure your knowledge is recognized." "That is not my concern," he said quietly. "What happens to shared vision when only one carries it forward?" His question cut to the heart of what had developed between them. Not merely practical cooperation, but genuine partnership that transcended cultural boundaries. By presenting herself alone to the approaching riders, Margaret would be severing that connection, at least in external appearance. Before she could respond, the distant sound of horses grew marginally louder. Decision time had arrived. They approach. "The canyon mouth," Kaya stated. "We must choose quickly." Margaret made a swift calculation. "Help me outside with the wheelchair. Make it appear weathered, as if it's been sitting in the sun. Then hide yourself, but stay close enough to hear. If I need you, I'll mention water systems 3 times in conversation." The code phrase was unnecessary, but it gave them both a sense of continued connection even as they prepared to separate. With efficient movements, Kaya helped position Margaret and her wheelchair near the shelter entrance, but far enough away that casual observation wouldn't immediately reveal the stone dwelling built into the canyon wall. "I will be watching," he promised, his hand briefly touching her shoulder before he disappeared among the rocks with the stealth of someone born to this environment. Margaret arranged herself to appear resourceful but weary, a survivor rather, than a victim. She placed Robert's engineering journal prominently on her lap and folded her hands atop it, waiting as the sounds of approaching riders grew steadily louder. When they finally came into view around the canyon bend, Margaret observed them carefully. 4 soldiers, as Kaya had reported, led by a civilian in a dust-covered suit, who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. They pulled up sharply at the sight of her, clearly surprised to find a white woman in a wheelchair calmly awaiting them in this desolate place. "Mrs. Hollister," the civilian called, spurring his horse forward. "Margaret Hollister of Copper Springs." "I was once of Copper Springs," Margaret replied with dignity. "Though the town made it clear I was no longer welcome after my husband's death." The man dismounted, approaching with a mixture of disbelief and what appeared to be reluctant admiration. "I'm Walter Thompson, territorial administrator from Santa Fe. These men," he gestured to the soldiers who remained mounted, watching curiously, "have been assigned to assist my investigation into your disappearance. As you can see, Mr. Thompson, I haven't disappeared. I've relocated." Margaret kept her tone steady, projecting capability rather than desperation. Thompson looked pointedly at her wheelchair, then at the harsh landscape surrounding them. "You cross miles of desert alone in your condition?" Margaret lifted her chin slightly. "My condition affects my legs, Mr. Thompson, not my mind or my determination." A flicker of respect crossed his features. "Evidently. May I ask how you've survived out here? The heat has been exceptional, even by territorial standards." "I found water," she replied, gesturing vaguely toward the canyon. "Applied techniques. My husband and I developed for desert conditions." She patted the journal in her lap. "Robert was an engineer. I assisted his work for years." Thompson glanced at the soldiers, then back to Margaret. "Mrs. Hollister, reports from Copper Springs indicated you left under concerning circumstances. Mayor Caldwell expressed grave doubt about your ability to survive independently." Margaret couldn't suppress a bitter laugh. "Mayor Caldwell expressed grave doubt about my value to the community the moment I became a widow. He suggested an institution as my only option." "Be that as it may," Thompson continued, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of conversation, "I've been tasked with resolving your situation. You cannot remain here alone." "I have no intention of remaining here indefinitely," Margaret assured him, adjusting her strategy. "I've been developing improved water collection systems." She held up Robert's journal. "Once I've refined the designs, I intend to present them at Fort Defiance, where my husband had contacts." Thompson's expression showed skepticism. "These designs, may I see them?" Margaret hesitated only briefly before opening the journal to their latest work, the collaborative designs that merged Western engineering with Hopi traditional knowledge. She watched Thompson's face as he studied the technical drawings, noting the moment when professional interest overtook his prejudice about her capabilities. "These are quite advanced," he admitted, turning a page to examine the details of the stepped filtration system. "Your husband's work?" "My husband began the research," Margaret corrected firmly. "I've continued and expanded it, incorporating techniques observed in indigenous water management systems." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Indigenous techniques? You've had contact with natives?" The question carried potential danger. Margaret chose her words carefully. "I've studied the ancient ruins in these canyons. The people who built them centuries ago developed remarkably effective water conservation methods. Our modern systems could benefit from their wisdom." "Interesting perspective," Thompson murmured, returning the journal. "Unconventional, but potentially valuable given the territory's water challenges." Margaret sensed a subtle shift in his assessment of her situation. "Mr. Thompson, I have no desire to burden anyone. My work on these water systems provides purpose and potential benefit to settlements throughout the territory. All I ask is the opportunity to complete my research and present it properly." The administrator studied her thoughtfully. "Your determination is commendable, Mrs. Hollister, regardless of the wisdom of your methods." He glanced around the canyon. "Again, however, I cannot in good conscience leave a widow alone in such conditions. The territorial government has certain responsibilities." Margaret felt her hopes sinking. Would all her careful explanation be dismissed in favor of proper placement in some institution or charity house? "Perhaps," Thompson continued unexpectedly, "arrangements could be made at Fort Defiance after all. The commanding officer there has expressed interest in improved water systems for some time. Your research might find appreciation there that was lacking in Copper Springs." The suggestion caught Margaret by surprise. "You would help facilitate such an arrangement." "My role includes promoting territorial development, Mrs. Hollister. If your water systems prove effective, they represent potential benefit that transcends unusual circumstances." He straightened his dust-covered jacket with a businessman's practicality. "But first, we must get you to proper shelter. We'll make camp tonight and depart for the fort tomorrow." As Thompson returned to consult with the soldiers, Margaret's mind raced. This outcome was neither rejection nor complete acceptance, but something in between, qualified recognition of her work's value while still removing her from the partnership that had created it. And what of Kaya? What of their shared vision for systems that would benefit both cultures? What of the connection that had grown between them during these weeks of collaboration? As if summoned by her thoughts, she caught the barest glimpse of movement among distant rocks, a sign that Kaya was still watching, still connected to her decision, even as external forces threatened to separate their paths. In that moment, Margaret realized that the approaching night would bring not just practical decisions about traveling to Fort Defiance, but deeper choices about which world she truly wished to inhabit, and whether boundaries considered fixed might yet prove permeable to those determined enough to cross them. The soldiers established their camp efficiently, raising 2 canvas tents at a respectful distance from where Margaret sat in her wheelchair. Thompson had invited her to join them for a meal of army rations supplemented with coffee, a luxury she hadn't tasted since leaving Copper Springs. As they ate, Thompson questioned her further about her water system designs, his initial skepticism gradually yielding to genuine interest. "These filtration techniques," he said, examining a sketch she had shared, "they're unlike standard army Corps approaches. Where did you develop these specific stepped channels?" Margaret chose her words with care. "Ancient peoples in these territories built similar systems that functioned for centuries. I studied their remains and adapted the principles to modern materials." "Resourceful," Thompson acknowledged, "though I imagine the Army engineers at Fort Defiance will want to thoroughly test your theories before implementation." "Of course," Margaret agreed, thinking of how she and Kaya had already built working models to prove each concept. Models currently hidden in the canyon shelter where Kaya remained concealed. As night deepened, Thompson insisted Margaret take one of the tents while he shared the other with the soldiers. The unexpected privacy gave her opportunity to reflect on her precarious position. Thompson's tentative acceptance of her work represented a potential path forward within white society, conditional respect for her knowledge, if not her complete personhood. Fort Defiance might indeed value her engineering skills more than Copper Springs had. Yet this path meant abandoning the deeper connection she had formed with Kaya, reducing their partnership to occasional furtive consultation if it continued at all. The territorial administrators might credit indigenous techniques in abstract terms, but would they acknowledge a specific Hopi contributor as equal partner in the work? Would they understand how the designs represented true integration of knowledge rather than mere appropriation? More personally, Could she simply walk away from the man who had saved her life, shared his home, and treated her with dignity, regardless of her physical limitations? A man whose wisdom and perspective had transformed her understanding of the desert and its peoples. Sleep eluded her as these questions circled endlessly. Through the thin canvas wall of the tent, she could hear the murmured conversation of soldiers taking watch shifts, occasional laughter, the comfortable sounds of men accustomed to frontier duty. They represented her ostensible community, the society she had been born into, and that now offered conditional reacceptance. Yet somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp, Kaya kept silent vigil, a man caught between worlds who had shown her possibilities neither culture fully recognized. Before dawn, Margaret made her decision. Using skills she had developed during weeks of adapting to life without conventional resources, she dressed silently and maneuvered her wheelchair to the tent entrance. The sentry posted nearby had grown complacent during his long watch, his attention focused on the canyon entrance rather than the camp itself. With practiced movements, Margaret eased herself from the tent and wheeled slowly toward the shadows at the camp's edge. The newly rebuilt wheelchair moved silently, its mechanisms improved through Kaya's craftsmanship. When she reached the deeper darkness beyond the soldiers' small campfire, she paused, listening intently for any sign of alarm. Nothing. The camp remained peaceful, unaware of her departure. Using hand signals Kaya had taught her, designed for Hopi hunters to communicate silently across distances, she indicated her presence and intention to those watching eyes she couldn't see but trusted were there. Then she waited, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. Minutes stretched like hours until a whisper came from nearby shadows. "You choose a difficult path." Kaya's voice, barely audible, carried neither judgment nor surprise. "I choose the true path," Margaret replied softly, "not the one others lay before me." Without further discussion, Kaya emerged from the darkness, moving with the silent efficiency that had initially unnerved but now reassured her. Together, they retreated deeper into the canyon, following routes invisible to those unfamiliar with the terrain. Margaret's wheelchair presented challenges on the uneven ground, but Kaya had prepared for this, identifying passages where the ancient inhabitants had created smoother surfaces for moving heavy stones. When they reached a small alcove, half a mile from the camp, screened from view by massive boulders, Kaya paused. "Thompson will search when he discovers you missing," he said, his practical mind already calculating risks and responses. "The soldiers will follow obvious trails. Will they find us?" Kaya's expression in the faint pre-dawn light held quiet confidence. "Not if we travel where they do not expect. There are paths known only to my people." He studied her face with unusual intensity. "But Margaret, this journey will be difficult for your wheelchair. We must move into higher canyons, cross rough terrain. I've chosen this," she reminded him, "whatever challenges come with it." He nodded once, accepting her decision. "Then we prepare now, travel after sunset. The soldiers will search in daylight, rest at night." They spent the day in tense preparation. From his seemingly endless knowledge of the canyon system, Kaya produced an alternative shelter, a deep overhang hidden behind a screen of desert vegetation where ancient peoples had once stored grain. There they gathered the most critical of their belongings, the water system designs, Robert's tools, essential supplies for desert travel, and modified components to make Margaret's wheelchair more suitable for rough terrain. "These will help," Kaya explained, attaching wider rims to her wheels that distributed weight more effectively on sandy surfaces. "And this," he lashed a small travois frame to the chair's rear, "will carry what you cannot." As they worked, Margaret found herself occasionally distracted by Kaya's focused movements, the intelligence in his hands as they adapted materials to new purposes, the quiet dignity that never wavered despite their precarious circumstances. Their partnership had evolved beyond mere survival cooperation or even intellectual collaboration. It had become something neither of their societies had vocabulary to adequately describe. "Why did you choose to leave?" Kaya asked suddenly, breaking their companionable silence. "Thompson offered you return to your people, recognition of your work." Margaret considered the question carefully, wanting her answer to reflect her true motivation rather than momentary impulse. "He offered conditional acceptance of sanitized versions of our work," she replied finally. "The water systems would be credited to me alone, adapted from anonymous indigenous techniques. Your contribution, your equal partnership, would be erased." Kaya's hands stilled on the wheelchair modifications. "Many would consider this reasonable compromise." "Would you?" She met his gaze directly. A rare smile touched his features. "No, truth matters, especially in work meant to serve both peoples." He resumed his task, adding quietly, "But that explains why you left our designs behind. It does not explain why you yourself left." The question penetrated to the heart of her decision, one she had made more from instinct than careful reasoning. And during the night, why had she chosen to flee relative safety and conditional acceptance for uncertain future with a man from a different world? "In Copper Springs, I was defined by what I lacked. My husband, my mobility," Margaret said slowly, finding words for feelings still forming. "With you, I am defined by what I contribute, my knowledge, my perspectives, my determination. The difference is—" She paused, searching for adequate expression. "The difference is everything." Kaya absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "Among my people there is a saying, 'The path that tests you most may lead you home.' Perhaps neither Copper Springs nor my village was truly your home." The insight resonated deeply. Margaret had never felt completely at ease in the rigid expectations of white society, even before her accident and widowhood had further marginalized her. Yet she could not pretend to belong in Hopi culture either, despite her respect for its wisdom. Perhaps her true place lay in the borderlands between worlds, creating bridges rather than choosing sides. As sunset approached, distant shouts echoed through the canyon. Thompson and his soldiers discovering her absence and beginning their search. Kaya listened intently to the patterns of movement, his experienced ear tracking their directions. "They split into two groups," he reported. "One returns to where we first met, the other follows the main canyon. Neither comes this way yet. Will they find the shelter, our work? Perhaps. I concealed what couldn't be carried, but soldiers trained to track will notice signs." He secured their packs to the wheelchair's travois. "It matters less now. We take the essential knowledge with us." Twilight deepened into night, stars emerging in brilliant profusion across the desert sky. When full darkness settled, Kaya led them from their hiding place, along paths Margaret would never have identified. Narrow spaces between massive boulders, dry watercourses hidden beneath overhanging vegetation. Occasional footholds worn into stone by centuries of passage. The wheelchair proved both blessing and challenge. Its improved design handled the terrain better than Margaret had dared hope, but some passages required Kaya to carry her while dragging the chair separately. These moments of physical dependence might once have humiliated her, but their partnership had evolved beyond such concerns. They were simply two people combining strengths to overcome obstacles, each contributing what they could. Near midnight, they reached a vantage point that offered views across the lower canyons. Far below, lanterns moved like fireflies as the search parties continued their methodical exploration. "They are persistent," Kaya observed. Thompson doesn't strike me as a man who accepts failure easily, Margaret replied, remembering the administrator's determined questioning about her water systems. He'll search until he convinces himself I've either perished or fled beyond territorial jurisdiction. Then we must give him reason to believe the latter. Kaya pointed toward distant mountains, barely visible against the night sky. Beyond those peaks lies Navajo country. Few white officials venture there willingly. Is that our destination? Kaya considered before answering. Not necessarily our final place, but a direction that offers possibilities. There are trading posts where people of different worlds meet with less judgment, places where your knowledge and mine might both find value. The notion of such borderland communities, neither fully white nor fully native, represented a third path Margaret hadn't previously considered. Not reinsertion into white society on its conditional terms, not attempted integration into Hopi culture where she would always remain an outsider, but creation of something new at the intersection of worlds. They traveled for 3 nights, resting in concealed locations during daylight hours. Kaya's knowledge of the canyon systems proved invaluable, leading them to hidden water sources and sheltered overhangs where ancient peoples had once found refuge. Along the way, he shared stories of this landscape, not just practical information about survival, but deeper cultural understandings of how the people and the land had shaped each other over countless generations. My grandfather came to these canyons as a young man seeking vision, he explained one evening as they camped beneath a massive cottonwood beside a tiny spring. He fasted for 7 days, drinking only the water that seeps from this very rock. On the 7th night, Spider Grandmother came to him in dreams, showing him how all things are connected by threads invisible to ordinary sight. Spider Grandmother appears often in your stories, Margaret observed, having heard the figure mentioned in several of Kaya's teachings. She is the weaver who connects worlds, he confirmed. She taught the people to create beauty from simple threads to find patterns. In seeming chaos, he gestured between them. Perhaps she weaves still, bringing together what others would keep separate. The mythic framing of their unlikely partnership offered perspective beyond practical circumstance, suggesting deeper purpose in their meeting and collaboration. Not mere chance or desperation, but pattern and intention visible only when viewed. From sufficient distance, on the 4th day, they reached a broader valley where the canyon system opened into more hospitable terrain. Small streams fed scattered growth of cottonwoods and willow, creating oases amid the desert expanse. In the distance, a thin plume of smoke rose from what appeared to be a small settlement. Yellow Canyon Trading Post, Kaya identified. Not our destination from before, but another place where boundaries blur. Navajo, Hopi, Mexican, white, all come here to trade. Is it safe? Margaret asked, eyeing the settlement with mixture of hope and apprehension. No place is entirely safe for those who walk between worlds, Kaya replied with characteristic honesty. But Jacob Davis, who runs the post, judges people by their dealings, not their origins. He has worked with my people for 20 years. They approached cautiously, observing the trading post from concealment before committing to enter. The small cluster of buildings appeared peaceful. A main adobe structure with attached storerooms, several smaller dwellings, corrals for livestock, and gardens irrigated by carefully channeled water from a nearby spring. Their water system is crude but functional, Margaret noted professionally. Simple diversion without filtration or conservation features. Kaya nodded. Many such places struggle during dry years. Your designs would improve their chances significantly. Our designs, Margaret corrected firmly. Their entrance to the trading post caused immediate but not hostile interest. A weathered man with a grey-streaked beard emerged from the main building, studying them with experienced eyes that noted Margaret's wheelchair and Kaya's tribal markers without obvious judgment. Jacob Davis, Kaya greeted him in English. It Has been several seasons. Kaya Tawanima, the man returned the greeting, didn't expect to see you before autumn trading. His gaze shifted to Margaret with undisguised curiosity, and with unusual company, I see. Margaret Hollister, she introduced herself directly, refusing to let others speak for her. Engineer and botanist, formerly of Copper Springs. Davis's eyebrows rose slightly. Long way from Copper Springs, ma'am, especially in your circumstances. He glanced between them, clearly piecing together an unusual story, but refraining from immediate questions. You'll be wanting water and a meal, I expect. My wife's just put on a pot of stew. The simple hospitality, offered without demands for explanation, eased tension Margaret hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Within the trading post's main room, they found an unexpected microcosm of territorial diversity. A Navajo family examined cloth goods while conversing in their language. A Mexican freight driver shared coffee with a weather-beaten white trapper. 2 Hopi women sorted herbs they had apparently brought to trade. None seemed particularly disturbed by Margaret and Kaya's arrival together, though occasional glances suggested curiosity rather than complete disinterest. Here, perhaps, unusual partnerships were common enough not to provoke immediate rejection. Over a simple but nourishing meal, Davis eventually inquired about their journey and intentions. Not from suspicious interrogation, but practical interest in travelers passing through his domain. We seek a place where knowledge can be shared without boundaries, Kaya explained. His usual reserve softened slightly in this relatively neutral environment. Margaret has designs for water systems that combine white engineering with Hopi wisdom. That so? Davis asked, interest piqued. He turned to Margaret. What sort of systems? Margaret described their collaborative work, explaining how traditional Hopi water management techniques enhanced conventional engineering approaches to create more sustainable and efficient collection systems. Davis listened with surprising attentiveness for a frontier trader, occasionally asking informed questions that revealed deeper understanding than his appearance suggested. Shows promise, he acknowledged when she finished. This territory's always one dry season away from disaster. Settlements that can manage water better have fighting chance at survival. Our designs need practical testing beyond models, Margaret admitted, and materials we couldn't access in the canyon. Davis stroked his beard thoughtfully. Territorial governments offering land grants to folks who can improve water access in marginal areas. Been trying to encourage settlement in regions previously considered too dry for farming. Government grants would require conventional arrangements, Margaret observed cautiously. Single ownership, standard contracts. On paper, perhaps, Davis agreed with a knowing look. But how folks actually arrange their affairs out here, who contributes what knowledge? He shrugged expressively. That's often left to those doing the work rather than those writing the documents. The implication was clear. Official structures could be navigated or adapted to accommodate unconventional partnerships, particularly in remote areas where results mattered more than rigid adherence to social boundaries. There's a small settlement forming near the junction of Cottonwood Creek and the Little Colorado, Davis continued. Mixed group. Some Mexicans familiar with irrigation, couple of Mormons pushed out of Utah for unorthodox ideas, a few independent types like myself. They're struggling with water management in poor soil. He gave them a measuring look. Might be receptive to new approaches, especially if demonstrated rather than merely proposed. How far? Kaya asked practically. 3 days east by wagon. A road territorial officials rarely visit, too remote to bother with unless problems arise. Davis's weathered face creased in a smile. Freedom often increases with distance from authority. That evening, as they settled into a small but clean room Davis provided, Margaret and Kaya discussed the unexpected possibility that had presented itself. not mere temporary refuge, but potential community where their collaborative work might find practical application. "What do you think?" Margaret asked as they reviewed their water system designs by lamplight. "Could a place like Davis, described, actually accept what we're trying to create?" Kaya considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. Frontier. Settlements form differently from established towns. Necessity often overcomes prejudice when survival depends on combining available skills. He traced a section of their filtration design thoughtfully, and people already living at boundaries may be more willing to cross them. You would be willing to try? To live among such a mixed community? "I have walked between worlds most of my life," Kaya replied. "What would be new is not having to walk alone." He met her gaze directly. "But you would be giving up much. The recognition Thompson offered, potential return to your own society." Margaret shook her head decisively. "I would be giving up conditional acceptance in exchange for genuine partnership." She placed her hand over his on the drawings that represented their shared vision. "I choose this path, whatever challenges it brings." The simple physical contact, her pale hand covering his darker one, symbolized everything words struggled to express. Different backgrounds, different traditions, different physical capabilities, yet united in purpose and growing connection that transcended conventional categories. 2 weeks later, Margaret stood beside her wheelchair at the edge of a small rise overlooking Cottonwood Junction. Below, a modest collection of structures huddled near the confluence of streams. Adobe buildings, simple timber frames, a few canvas tents serving as temporary dwellings. Gardens showed evidence of struggling irrigation systems, channels cut into rocky soil with more determination than technical expertise. Beside her, Kaya surveyed the settlement with practiced assessment. The main channel loses too much water to seepage. Their retention pond is poorly placed for soil conditions. Problems we know how to solve, Margaret replied, patting the leather case containing their comprehensive designs. "If they will listen to both of us," Kaya added, the slight emphasis acknowledging the uncertainty in how their unusual partnership would be received even in this supposedly more open community. As if reading her thoughts, he continued, "Whatever happens, we have already created something neither of our peoples thought possible. Our designs exist, even if others cannot yet see their value." "They'll see," Margaret said with quiet confidence. "Not everyone, not immediately, but enough to matter." She reached for his hand, a gesture that had evolved from tentative to natural during their journey. The work matters, the partnership matters more. Together they began their descent toward the settlement, two figures moving in coordinated purpose. Despite outward differences, a wheelchair navigating carefully down the slope, guided occasionally by supportive hands. Knowledge from separate traditions merged into unified vision. Individuals rejected by their respective societies who had discovered unexpected connection in the borderlands between worlds. Whatever reception awaited them in Cottonwood Junction, they moved toward it not as rescuer and rescued, not as teacher and student, but as genuine partners who had found in each other's differences not limitations to overcome, but complementary strengths to combine. The desert that had nearly claimed Margaret's life had instead revealed possibilities neither she nor Kaya could have discovered alone, that boundaries considered fixed might prove permeable to those with courage to cross them, that wisdom existed in unexpected places when one had eyes to see it, and that genuine partnership could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when need, respect, and growing affection transcended the artificial divisions of human society. As they approached the first buildings of the settlement, curious eyes turned in their direction. Witnessing the arrival of a crippled widow and a Hopi scout who had defied every expectation to forge a path neither could have walked alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.